As the summer wore on, this appreciation of Dr. Bickleigh's for his mistress increased more and more. His growing affection warmed her, and she spread the wings of her charming butterfly soul to it. Her own love for him had remained surprisingly constant, and now that the danger threatened by Chatford's retrospective jealousy had disappeared, she became gay and light-hearted. Their bi-weekly meetings were merrier than the old ones had ever been. Tears were a thing of the past. Ivy gained in poise without, however, losing the childishness that was her chief charm to him. She saw that her new smartness pleased him and added to her attractiveness in his eyes, and she exploited this fresh possibility with naive delight, dressing herself up for him just like a little girl in her mother's hat and furs, and with much the same result, always trying to have some new and interesting article of clothing on, if only a new shade in silk stockings, and submitting gravely every new hat or frock for his approval. The attitude which Ivy always contrived to present, of hanging on his slightest word, exactly suited the new addition of Dr. Bickleigh. He, who had been a doormat himself all his life, till in one supreme gesture he had cast off doormattery for ever, now wanted a doormat of his own, and Ivy was the ideal doormat. He began to think very seriously about Ivy. He saw now that he had not been so far wrong after all 3 years ago, when he recognized in her the girl he really ought to have married. Only the recognition was premature. He had not been developed enough to appreciate her. He was still a slave to leading strings, and missed them when absent. But now, an old vision, 3 years out of date, was resuscitated, looked over, and found comely. Once more cricket was pushed aside. A brand new vision made its appearance about this time too. A most absorbing vision, which seemed to be continually expanding and expanding like a rubber pig. The germ of it was in the Ivy vision. For Ivy to become Mrs. Bickleigh, the previous elimination of Chatford was obviously required. An inconvenient husband can be eliminated in 2 ways, by divorce or death. Divorce held this disadvantage, that Ivy would come to him penniless, and he, as co-respondent, would have to leave Wyvern's Cross and set up elsewhere. With Madeleine's money to support him till he got his footing, that was simple. In this case, it would be impossible. But death held this positive advantage, that not only could Ivy come to him, but as Chatford's widow, she would come embellished by Chatford's not inconsiderable possessions. How exceedingly nice, then, from every aspect, if Chatford were to die. That was the original vision. Its expansion was on these lines. How exceedingly nice if, while death was about, not only Chatford, but Madeleine too, and anybody else obnoxious to Dr. Edmund Bickleigh, were to be happily removed by it. It was not for some weeks after he had decided to murder Chatford and Madeleine that Dr. Bickleigh took any active steps in the matter. Murder is a serious business. The slightest slip may be disastrous. Dr. Bickleigh had no intention of risking disaster. Chapter 10. Dr. Bickleigh read De Quincey on Murder as a Fine Art. He was impressed with Thomas Griffith Wainwright, but considered John Williams anything but an artist. On the whole, however, he agreed with the author. Murder could be a fine art, but it was not for everyone. Murder was a fine art for the Superman. It was a pity that Nietzsche could not have developed De Quincey's propositions. Dr. Bickleigh had no doubt whatever that in Murder he had qualified not only as a fine artist, but as a Superman. It was a pleasant sensation. It gave one a feeling of confidence and power, to know that one really could rid oneself of anyone who became impossible. The only pity was that the artist in this particular medium should be unable to point proudly to his triumphs. Art for art's sake. But Dr. Bickleigh still could not think of his own experiments really as murder. There was quite a perceptible difference between what he had done and proposed to do and murder, though he could not altogether define it. Still, murder or not, the method had got to receive meticulous attention. Dr. Bickleigh pondered over it closely. Certain broad rules were obvious. The deaths must appear either natural or accidental, anything but designed. Dr. Bickleigh had nothing but scorn for those murderers who dispatch their victims in one of the obvious ways, riddled with bullets, sliced with a hatchet or stuffed full of arsenic, and rely on bad detective work for their escape. His method was to be a great deal more subtle than that. A great man is one who can not only seize his opportunities, but recognize them. Dr. Bickleigh knew that, and spent some time in looking for his own, turning over, in the meantime, just as he had done before, a dozen different plans. When his opportunity, a case of virulent botulism in one of his own patients, did offer itself, Dr. Bickleigh recognized it at once, and paid a visit to the Merchester Public Library. Then he bought an incubator. He was no bacteriologist, but to make a culture of Bacillus botulinus was simple. Dr. Bickleigh made one. The more he tested this idea, the better he liked it. Chatford's death would present every natural appearance. There was the case in Wyvern's Cross to prove that contaminated food was circulating in the district. In matters of food contamination, neither Chatford nor Madeleine could be expected to be immune. No suspicion of design could possibly arise. On the other hand, the method, though safe, was uncertain. It was impossible to ensure death. Still, the plan presented so many advantages that this one drawback could not outweigh them. And, if failure did follow, it was always possible to make a second attempt, when their powers of resistance would have been weakened by the first illness, and success then would be almost inevitable. Dr. Bickleigh invented some legal business, and asked Chatford to tea in a few days' time to discuss it. To Dr. Bickleigh's annoyance, Chatford proved difficult. He was not Dr. Bickleigh's legal adviser, and, in the curt note which he sent in reply to the doctor's friendly letter of invitation, he intimated quite plainly that he had no wish to become Dr. Bickleigh's legal adviser. Dr. Bickleigh rang him up, and Chatford told him in dry tones that he was far too busy to go out to Wyvern's Cross to tea, but that business, if Dr. Bickleigh persisted, could always be discussed in his office in Merchester. Dr. Bickleigh complained bitterly to Ivy of the way in which Chatford rejected his advances. And then, suddenly and most unexpectedly, Chatford rang up to say in the most friendly way that he found he was going to be in the neighbourhood of Wyvern's Cross 2 afternoons later, and would very much like to call in for a cup of tea, if that would be convenient. Dr. Bickleigh, delighted, assured him that it would be quite convenient. He was unable to ask Ivy whether it was she who had brought about this change of heart, for Ivy did not turn up at their rendezvous the next day. Instead, there was a note from her, addressed to the fictitious name in which Dr. Bickleigh had hired the room, to tell him that William had suddenly packed her off, at about 5 minutes' notice, to Spain, her dear. He had a sister who had a husband who lived in Spain as the representative of a large British engineering firm, and though Ivy had never met them, they had written out of the blue to ask her and Chatford, or her alone, if Chatford could not come too, to go over and visit them at once in Barcelona. And William had insisted on her doing so, simply wouldn't take no for an answer. It was the chance of a lifetime. It would be a great treat for her. She had not been looking too fit lately, and the change would be most beneficial, 100 reasons. Teddy needn't worry. It wasn't because William suspected anything, that was quite certain, because he had never been nicer. And she would see him again in the autumn, and would miss him terribly, and love him always, and write to him every day, and he was to write to her just as often. Dr. Bickleigh was sorry, and he did miss her. But he was pleased that such a piece of luck had befallen her, and there was always the autumn, and a rest never did anyone any harm. He turned the Jowett back from Merchester and headed for the Hall. During the last year, he had scarcely seen Madeleine at all. They had passed once or twice on the roads, but always contrived not to see each other, and people had had the tact not to ask them to the same gatherings. It was with a curious sense of re-entering the past that he drove up the gravel sweep to the house. Mr. and Mrs. Bourne were at home. The parlour-maid, the same parlour-maid, hardly knew whether to look welcoming or embarrassed, but succumbed to Dr. Bickleigh's infectious smile. She kept him waiting in the hall for a few minutes before summoning him to the drawing-room. Madeleine and Denny were at tea. Denny was the only one who showed awkwardness. His face expressed plain hostility. Madeleine, on the other hand, looked merely as if this, of all moments, was the one she had been awaiting for the last 12 months. Even Dr. Bickleigh, who thought he knew the depths of her duplicity, was surprised. He followed her cue and tried to look the same. Sitting between them, he hinted delicately at the object of his visit. Without exactly naming it, he suggested that there had been a silly feud, that Wyvern's Cross was too tiny to hold feuds, and that he had come in frank and manly manner to insinuate an apology for anything he had done which might not have been approved, and hoped that the hatchet might now be considered buried. As he had shrewdly guessed, this situation appealed to Madeleine. She threw herself into it, heart and eyes. The two vied with each other in noble exchanges and generous hints. Denny, puzzled and earthily suspicious, might not have been there at all. Dr. Bickleigh came away with a greater contempt for his hostess than before. If he had cared to take the trouble, he was convinced he could make Madeleine his mistress within a week. He did not care, for he came away also with Madeleine's promise to come with her husband to tea the next day. When he got in, Dr. Bickleigh ran straight upstairs to the attic, where, among a litter of oddments, he kept the incubator. He stayed there some time, regarding the happy family inside with a loving eye. Botulism is caused chiefly by contaminated sausages. It may, argued Dr. Bickleigh, be caused just as readily by contaminated potted meat. There were to be potted meat sandwiches for tea. By Dr. Bickleigh's orders, tea was ready in good time, but the food was not taken into the drawing-room. Nobody should have a chance afterwards to say that he had been left alone with it. Instead, Mrs. Holnes's attention in the kitchen was directed for just 2 seconds elsewhere, and 2 of the sandwiches were whisked into Dr. Bickleigh's ready handkerchief. Subsequently, Mrs. Holnes would be able to swear that she had had them all under her direct observation from the time when she cut them to the time when they were carried into the drawing-room under the noses of the visitors. Not, of course, that there would ever be occasion to swear any such thing, but Dr. Bickleigh could not forget now that he was an artist. As he spread his bacilli on the potted meat upstairs in the attic 2 minutes later, his only conscious thought was that he must not forget to put them back on the plate with their distinguishing marks, a tiny pink smear of potted meat on a corner of the white bread uppermost. Of Madeleine and Chatford he did not think at all. Now that the affair had gone into action, those two had almost ceased to be human beings to him at all. They had become symbols. It was going to be a neat business. Only a tiny smear of the culture was used. The rest was kept in case, improbably, of a second administration becoming necessary, and a minute bit was to be added that night to the jar of potted meat before it was thrown away next day when the news of the two illnesses came through. It is the little points that count. As before, the thing would be utterly detection-proof. How simple murder was, in the right hands. Murder? Well, yes. In a way, it was murder. How odd. The administration was mere child's play. Dr. Bickleigh kept the plate of sandwiches on the cake stand beside him. The two contaminated ones were on the extreme side of the plate. He offered it first to Madeleine and then to Chatford. Both took the sandwich nearest to them. It was as easy as a conjurer forcing a card on a yokel. Dr. Bickleigh could have laughed out loud at their simplicity. While they all engaged in rather stilted conversation, he covertly watched Madeleine and Chatford eating death. Chatford rushed upon his, caught napping this time for all his dry caution. Madeleine toyed delicately with hers, pretending, of course, the fool, that her soul was above such earthly things as food and drink. Denny, obviously dragged at her heels, ate in morose silence, looking suspiciously at the food, for all the world as if he thought it might be poisoned. What an idea! Dr. Bickleigh felt less pity for them than he had felt for Julia. In a way, she had not deserved to die, and these two did. In a way, too, it was Madeleine who had really murdered Julia. At any rate, far more so than himself. Well, Julia was getting her vengeance. As Dr. Bickleigh watched the last morsel of sandwich disappear into her rat trap of a mouth, yes, positively, in these days Madeleine's mouth was a veritable rat trap. He experienced a strange sensation. He wanted to roar with laughter, shout, sing, snap his fingers, bowl aloud. His chest seemed to be swelling so that he had to keep drawing great breaths to fill it. It was a strange sensation, yet in a way familiar. Suddenly he remembered. It had been just the same when he was driving away from the little wood a year ago after he had hit Ivy in the face. He had to talk, chatter nonsense, crack silly jokes. So bubbling was his merriment that the others were infected too. Even Denny laughed. The stiltedness disappeared completely. Dr. Bickleigh, hugging his joy, saw the whole thing amusedly in newspaper headlines. Laughter at death feast. Doomed guests joke after fatal sandwiches. Microbes and mirth. As her restraint lessened, Dr. Bickleigh watched too the real Madeleine appear. Her egoism was incredible. It was impossible to keep any topic for more than an initial moment on the impersonal plane. Madeleine could only view it as it affected herself. If cars came up for discussion, with an incipient argument between Denny and Chatford as to the merits of two different makes, Madeleine would intervene with reminiscences of her own surprised skill in driving, and the astonishing accidents which only her own coolness and composure had enabled her to avoid. If the latest play in London was mentioned, Madeleine was led without hesitation to give them anecdotes of the famous actors she had met, and how they had one and all told her that the stage was simply waiting for her to conquer it, offered her immediate engagement as their leading lady, and almost burst into tears on her noble refusal to take the bread out of hard-working but inferior actresses' mouths. If anyone anywhere had done anything, Madeleine had done the same thing better. Denny said more than once in a weary tone, "Yes, dear, you're wonderful." Dr. Bickleigh was delighted. But he was careful not to make the mistake of keeping the thing going too long. As soon as reasonably possible, he made the excuse of a couple of urgent visits before surgery to ensure his guest's departure. Bacillus botulinus is a tricky fellow, and Dr. Bickleigh did not wish to run the risk of having anyone taken ill before reaching home. To Chatford on the doorstep he made perfunctory excuses. It was a nuisance. Mr. and Mrs. Bourne's unexpected arrival had made it impossible for him to discuss his business that day. Chatford must come out some other afternoon, and they could go into it properly. Chatford quite understood. Having thus arranged for a second administration, in the unlikely event of Chatford being alive to require it, Dr. Bickleigh methodically set about perfecting perfection. It was with an air of slight amusement at himself that he went into the kitchen to interview Mrs. Hone. These details were unnecessary, really, of course, but they were half the fun. They made all the difference between a slipshod and a finished piece of work. Dr. Bickleigh knew he was not taking a sordid joy in murder for murder's sake, but he did think that he might allow himself a cynical appreciation of a work of fine art. Mrs. Hone was a thin, melancholy woman, quite ready at all times to anticipate the worst. "Oh, Mrs. Hone," Dr. Bickleigh said, with his usual deprecatory smile on invading the kitchen, "are you sure that potted meat was quite all right? The sandwiches tasted just a little bit funny to me." "Well, it was only open this afternoon, sir, and it looked fresh enough, but it's been not enough today to turn anything," Mrs. Hone sighed, "and that's a fact." "Well, have you got the jar handy? I'd like to have a sniff at it." Mrs. Hone brought the jar, sniffing at it herself. "It does smell a bit queer, sir, now you come to mention it." Great is the power of suggestion. Dr. Bickleigh sniffed too. "Very queer. You're quite right, Mrs. Hone. It had better be thrown away. We don't want to run any risks after that poor Sampford child. I'll drop it in the dustbin myself." Yes. On the whole, it seemed to come better today than deferring it till tomorrow. He went out through the back kitchen and did so, smearing the fragment of infected jelly from his culture on it as he went. That fragment would soon infect the whole contents of the pot. What was to happen to the latter after its disposal in the dustbin, Dr. Bickleigh did not know or care. That could be left to look after itself. Meanwhile, there was the sheer artistry of the action. And that was all there was to be done. How simple it was. Dr. Bickleigh strolled back to the drawing-room, humming an air from the Marriage of Figaro, and strummed on the piano till it was time for surgery. He was self-taught, but he did not play too badly, and it afforded him a good deal of satisfaction. News came the next morning, from Mrs. Hone. In a village, an event has only to take place for everyone in the neighbourhood to know it, apparently almost simultaneously and without visible communication. "Have you heard the news, sir?" Dr. Bickleigh laid his knife and fork across his breakfast bacon and braced himself for the best. "No? What?" "Mrs. Bourne, sir. Up to the all, Took very bad in the night, they say. Had to have Dr. Lidston out from Merchester and all." "Dear me," Dr. Bickleigh clucked, looking properly solemn. "How very dreadful. I hope it isn't serious." "According to what they say, sir, it's about as serious as it could be," returned Mrs. Holmes with mournful relish. "Now that's very queer. I was taken quite bad myself last night. Nothing serious, of course, but, No, I think you'd better take this bacon away, Mrs. Holmes. I don't feel up to it, really. I'll just have a bit of dry toast and some coffee." Well, really, what a curious coincidence. Mrs. Holmes grasped her cue. "Why, sir, you don't think it could have been that potted meat, do you?" "Good gracious me! I'd never thought any more about that. I wonder." "It's quite possible, Mrs. Holmes. Dear me, how dreadful." "Well, it did smell queer, sir, and that's a fact. They didn't say anything about Mr. Dennis being took bad, but what about the other gentleman, Mr. Chatford, sir?" "I haven't heard anything," Dr. Bickleigh said doubtfully. "And in any case we can't be sure, you know, Mrs. Holmes. We mustn't jump to conclusions. Of course, if Mr. Chatford is... But there, we must wait and see." "Well, glad I am that I didn't touch the stuff, sir," observed Mrs. Holmes, taking a reluctant departure. "It's not often that I'm spared anything, but at any rate, I didn't have any of that." She went out, a firmly established witness. Dr. Bickleigh smiled gently as he helped himself to toast. He missed his bacon, but one must be prepared for some discomfort in a good cause. The annoying thing was that no news came through about Chatford. Most annoying. Twice during his morning's work, Dr. Bickleigh called in at Fairlawn to see if any sort of message had arrived, but there was nothing. His suspense grew. It was even more tantalizing than in his premarital betting days, waiting for the result of the 3:30. After lunch he could stand it no longer. He took up the telephone receiver and gave Chatford's private number. "I'm sorry," came a female voice over the wire. "Mr. Chatford's ill in bed." Dr. Bickleigh's heart executed a little triumphant leap. "Ill, is he? I'm very sorry to hear that. This is Dr. Bickleigh speaking from Wyvern's Cross. I hope it's nothing serious." The maid at the other end hesitated obviously. I don't know, sir." There reached Dr. Bickleigh's eager ears the sounds of a whispered colloquy. Asking the cook how much she ought to tell me, he thought. "Well, what are the symptoms?" he asked impatiently. Again there was a long pause before the answer was given, but this time Dr. Bickleigh could detect no whispering. "We think he must have eaten something that's disagreed with him, sir." "Indeed? Now that's very curious. I don't know if you know, but Mr. Chatford was here to tea yesterday, and I was taken bad myself last night, and, so I hear, was Mrs. Bourne, who was here too." No echo of all Julia's attempts at training him reminded Dr. Bickleigh of the reprehensibility of entering into details with servants. "I'm beginning to fear that it must have been something we had here. Will you run up and give Mr. Chatford my compliments and tell him that I shall be in Merchester this afternoon and would like to call in and see him? Not in a professional capacity, of course, but if he wouldn't mind my examining him, really for my own peace of mind. Will you tell him that?" "Yes, sir. Hold on, please." As he waited, Dr. Bickleigh congratulated himself on the inspiration. That he was committing a heinous breach of professional etiquette worried him not at all. As weighed against the tremendous advantage of insinuating himself as secondary medical adviser to Chatford, that meant nothing at all. why, the man would be completely in his hands. If he did not die of this first administration, a second would be even easier, and a third, if necessary, and a fourth. Not, of course, that a third would be necessary. And besides, he would be able to diagnose botulism at once, and get that fact established from the beginning. That he came straight from a similar case of his own would make such a startling diagnosis perfectly feasible. Lydston would miss such an unusual possibility almost certainly. Everything fitted in. Dr. Bickleigh felt no more emotion over Chatford than he had yesterday. The man had got to be put out of the way, and the more simply the better. But the return of the maid brought a check to his plans. "Mr. Chatford's compliments, sir, but Dr. Lydston's got his case in hand, and he's afraid he's too ill to see anyone else." "I see," said Dr. Bickleigh smoothly. "Then just give him my condolences." But his hand was shaking with anger as he hung up the receiver. That had been a snub direct. Damn the fellow! Of all the infernal impudence! Dr. Bickleigh felt it to be sheer presumption on Chatford's part to refuse opportunities in this way of being neatly polished off. He went along to his consulting room and sat down to think the situation over. The more he pondered it, the more desirable did it seem that he should gain access to Chatford's bedside. Not merely desirable, imperative. Why, the fellow might recover otherwise, and then the whole business would have to be begun again from the beginning. He would hardly be able to use the same plan twice, too, and he could never find another so perfect as this one. It was inconceivable that Chatford should be allowed to recover. As for Madeleine, Dr. Bickleigh was by now not nearly so emphatic. It would be nice if the creature were to die, and he would be doing the world a service, and, incidentally, Denny, by ridding it of her. But if the improbable happened, and she did nothing of the sort, well, let her live. She should have her chance, but Chatford, he was impossible. Dr. Bickleigh was overcome for a moment with a sense of awe as he sat at his table in judgment. Awe of himself and this tremendous power that he had grasped. He saw himself from the outside, a small, grim figure meting out life or death. Had he once really accepted himself as insignificant? Really? His plan formed itself. A natural anxiety possessed him to find out exactly how bad Madeleine was. That could be fitted in. He would go up to the hall that afternoon and see her. There should be no difficulty about that. He was sure he could rely on his standing with the parlour-maid to induce her so far to forget her training as to show him straight into Madeleine's bedroom. After all, he was a doctor. Then he would go boldly to Chatford's house in Merchester the next morning, armed with the authority of Madeleine's reception of him, and... The small, grim figure stiffened. The mild blue eyes glinted stonily. Once inside Chatford's house. That evening, Dr. Bickleigh received a most unexpected visitor. He had had a successful afternoon in a way. That is, Jenny had been out, and he had penetrated without difficulty to Madeleine's bedside. Madeleine had not seemed in the least pleased to see him. He guessed that the parlour-maid would be in for a bad 5 minutes after he left, and with a pose of prudery verging on the indelicate, had kept the girl in the room with them during the whole of his 10-minute stay. In the same spirit of purity incarnate, she had refused to let him make the least examination, even to the extent of taking her pulse, and her embarrassment was so exaggerated as to appear something like panic. One would have thought she had never had a doctor in her bedroom before, or any being in trousers at all, and she a married woman. Good God! Hadn't the fool the very faintest idea where to draw the line? It isn't necessary to simulate terror in order to indicate a clean mind. Dr. Bickleigh had looked down at the cocoon-like form wrapped in protective bedclothes and thanked heaven sincerely for his escape. Poor young fool of a Denny. But there, success had left him, for Madeleine was not nearly so ill as he had hoped. Not nearly so ill, in fact, as she ought by every right to have been. Not only not at death's door, but a mile out of sight of it. It was very disappointing. But that, Dr. Bickleigh had reflected philosophically, is the worst of those food germs. They are so hopelessly unreliable. Still, he was a fair man. He had decided that Madeleine should have her chance, and he would not go back on his decision. Madeleine could live. But it was very much to be hoped that Chatford had not been affected so lightly too. Dr. Bickleigh was thinking, when his visitor arrived, that now, more than ever, it was imperative for him to get into Chatford's bedroom the next morning. There being no servant in the house at night, Dr. Bickleigh had nowadays to answer the door himself in the evenings. On the doorstep stood a large, solid man, with a benevolent face, a heavy moustache, and a bowler hat inappropriately gilded with the last rays of the setting sun. He was a stranger to Dr. Bickleigh. "Yes?" said the doctor in some surprise. Strangers are rare in Wyvern's Cross. "I am Dr. Bickleigh. Do you want me?" "Just a few words, if you don't mind, Doctor," returned the large stranger with a deprecatory air. "Here's my card. Perhaps you won't mind if I come in?" Without waiting for permission, he came in, though still with the same apologetic look. Dr. Bickleigh, his surprise growing, took the card. The next instant his heart seemed to jump right up into his throat and lodged there, for on the card he read, "Chief Inspector Russell, CID, New Scotland Yard." Fortunately, it was dark in the hall, and Dr. Bickleigh, fighting down a sudden, nauseating panic, was able to shut the front door on his confusion. Almost the next moment the worst of his terror had been dispelled by sheer reason. On whatever mysterious quest this man had come, of course it could not be because any suspicion had arisen concerning himself. That, at any rate, was out of the question. It could not have been more than 10 seconds before he replied, in a perfectly normal voice, "Of course, Chief Inspector. Come along to my consulting room." Seated in his own chair, with the Chief Inspector in that reserved for patients, Dr. Bickleigh felt his full confidence return. He could almost have laughed at the remembrance of that moment of foolish panic as he pulled out his cigarette case and offered it with a friendly smile over the table. "You smoke, I expect." "Well, thank you, sir," said the Chief Inspector, extracting a cigarette from the packed case with a deftness which the largeness of his fingers would not have led one to expect. "I don't mind if I do." He produced matches from his pocket. "Now, what is it you wanted to see me about?" Dr. Bickleigh asked, when the cigarettes were alight. "No trouble among any of my patients, I hope?" Rather a good touch, that. "No, sir. Oh, no, nothing like that." The big man seemed quite ill at ease. Watching him, Dr. Bickleigh felt his own confidence increase. He was going to be more than a match for this blundering policeman. It was to be the rapier and the bludgeon once more. "No trouble among your patients? Rather more personal than that, I'm afraid, sir." "Indeed?" Dr. Bickleigh was nothing but frankly puzzled. "Personal, eh? What on earth—" The man from Scotland Yard did not seem to know quite how to proceed. Dr. Bickleigh's contempt for him grew.
"Well, you know, sir, we have to look into these rumours," he apologised, "just as a matter of form. I'm really sorry to have to bother you with it, but there it is. So if you wouldn't mind answering a few questions."
What rumours? No, that was a mistake. Of course one could not live in Wyverns Cross and not know that rumours existed or what their purport was. Dr. Bickleigh corrected himself neatly. "Oh, why, good gracious, you don't mean—"
"Afraid so, sir,"
mumbled the Chief Inspector. He might have been apologising for all the malicious gossip of rural England.
"Unpleasant for you, and unpleasant for me, too, having to rake it all up, but I'm sure you'll be sensible and see that."
"Oh, of course. But really—" Dr. Bickleigh laughed quite naturally. "Well, it's too preposterous, you know. Of course I won't pretend not to know that there have been the most atrocious rumours about my poor wife. De mortuis nil nisi bonum doesn't hold good in villages like this, you know."
No, sir. Probably not,"
agreed Chief Inspector Russell vaguely.
"And of course I've no doubt it's all a mare's nest, but there you are."
"But in any case, Chief Inspector, does it matter? That's what I don't quite understand. My poor wife's dead now. Whether her death was accidental, as of course really was the case, or whether, as this infernal gossip suggests, she may have deliberately taken her own life. What does it matter? No amount of investigation is going to bring her back to life." Chief Inspector Russell adopted a somewhat guiltily confidential air.
"Well, sir, I needn't tell you how jealous these coroners are of their privileges. You've had plenty of experience of that, I dare say. And if they think there's been a mistake made, or some evidence didn't come out which ought to have done, well, you know as well as I do, sir, that they've got the powers, and they will use them. So there you are."
Dr. Bickleigh nodded. There seemed something of a non sequitur somewhere, but the Chief Inspector was looking so very apologetic, and as if his task was so distasteful to him, that Dr. Bickleigh thought it better not to press for the connection. "Of course, I quite understand."
"That's right. I was sure you would, sir. So if you'll just let me put my questions, simply as a matter of form, I've no doubt that'll be the last you'll hear of the matter."
"Certainly, Chief Inspector. But talking's dry work, you know. I've got some whisky in the dining room. I'll bring the decanter along before you begin." The Chief Inspector lifted an enormous hand.
Not for me, if you please, sir. I never touch it."
"You don't?" said Dr. Bickleigh incredulously.
"Well, not when I'm when I'm working,"
qualified the other.
"Makes me too muddled, that's a fact."
"I'll bring the decanter anyhow. Perhaps you'll reconsider it later." As he went in search of the siphon and glasses, Dr. Bickleigh allowed his secret smile full play. The situation was really too delightfully ironical. Here was this absurd inspector making laborious inquiries as to the possibility of Julia having committed suicide, when the real truth, right under his nose, was about the last thing in the world he was suspecting. What would he say if Dr. Bickleigh told him that truth straight out? "No, Chief Inspector. My wife's death was not accidental. It was deliberate. But she didn't kill herself. I killed her." He would refuse to believe it, of course. Probably say something facetious about doctors having to have their little joke. But they couldn't pull his leg. He was too old a bird for that. Good God! What was Scotland Yard coming to? As a taxpayer, Dr. Bickleigh felt quite indignant. He returned to the consulting room, prepared actually to enjoy himself. The situation was not merely amusing, it was, in a way, exciting too. He felt a strong temptation to make it more exciting still, play with fire, drop subtle hints that this comic opera detective would never understand. But of course, he must not do anything of the sort. That would be inartistic over-elaboration. The Chief Inspector was engaged in studying a fat black notebook. He waited till Dr. Bickleigh had mixed himself a drink, purposely not at all a stiff one. Then he began. For a mere matter of form, Dr. Bickleigh felt his inquiries were remarkably searching. Not that it mattered, of course, for there was a ready answer waiting for every possible question. But it all seemed very unnecessary. First of all, Julia's illness was gone into at great length. How it began, her symptoms, the visit to Sir Tammerton Folliot, her 2 holidays, every detail. Dr. Bickleigh, smiling inwardly, again brought out his remarks about cerebral cortices and cachectic conditions, which had served so well for Victor Crewe-Stanton, but this time they were laboriously entered in the inspector's black notebook. Dr. Bickleigh began to yawn. Then they went on to the question of morphia. Dr. Bickleigh explained exactly what had happened, how he had refused to administer any more injections and why, and the distressing sequel to that refusal. It was perfectly plain sailing, for he had only to tell the truth. "I see," quite agreed the inspector. "And you never realized she had begun to help herself?" "Indeed I did," retorted Dr. Bickleigh. "Of all the obvious traps. I noticed that my stock of morphia was dwindling, and there was only one explanation." "But you did nothing about it?" Oh, really, this was too puerile. "Naturally I did, Chief Inspector. Do you imagine I wanted to encourage my wife in such a dangerous practice? I locked it up." "Locked morphia up," repeated the Chief Inspector, entering the fact. "And what happened then, sir?" "If you must know," Dr. Bickleigh replied with apparent reluctance, "she forged my name to an order for a large quantity on a chemist in Merchester. It is exceedingly painful for me to have to tell you all this." "Naturally it is, sir, naturally. And I needn't say I don't like having to ask you. By the way, you haven't got that order still, by any chance? Didn't recover it from the chemist and put it by, I suppose?" "How curious you should ask that," Dr. Bickleigh positively beamed. "As a matter of fact, that's exactly what I did. I queried it, of course, when the bill came in, and the man showed me the order. I didn't say anything to him, but I did get it back, just to be on the safe side, you know." "Of course. Very wise of you, I'm sure," assented the Chief Inspector with much heartiness. "Now, could I just have a look at that document, sir?" "Certainly. I'll get it at once. In fact, I believe it's in one of these drawers." He found it. The Chief Inspector examined it closely. "I think I'd better keep this, if you don't mind, sir," he said, and without waiting for a reply, tucked it carefully away in a large pocket-book. "Not at all," said Dr. Bickleigh, who, in any case, had not the least objection. The inspector went on to something apparently quite irrelevant. Dr. Bickleigh's movements after lunch on the fatal day. Noticing the doctor's eyebrows rise, he hinted in deprecatory tones that there were vague but scandalous suggestions of negligence somewhere. And though it was obvious that Chief Inspector Russell himself did not attach the faintest importance to such an outrageous idea, he was, unfortunately, precluded by his duty from treating it with the scorn they demanded. With just the right amount of indignation, Dr. Bickleigh detailed his movements, how he had gone out almost immediately after lunch, what he could remember of the visits he had made, his meeting with Miss Ridgway at a moment when he was having a little trouble with his car, his subsequent actions ending with a visit to the hall, where his housemaid had been able to catch him with the terrible news. Anxious to afford the Chief Inspector every help, he turned up his day-book to see if any corroboration was to be found there. By a coincidence, which both men agreed to be most lucky, there was actually, for that day only, a detailed time list of the visits he had paid. Dr. Bickleigh explained that he remembered now having entered it up that evening in an attempt to distract his thoughts from the tragedy that had overtaken him. The Chief Inspector, alternating between sympathy and apology, copied the extract meticulously into his notebook. "Well, surely that's all I can tell you which can have any possible bearing on my poor wife's death," Dr. Bickleigh sighed when the copy had been made. "Now, Chief Inspector, let me offer you that drink again."
"No, thank you, sir. It's very good of you, I'm sure, but—"
The Chief Inspector looked quite uncomfortable.
"Well, sir, to tell you the truth, I haven't quite finished yet, if you'd be so good."
"There's something else you want to ask me?"
"Something else I'm afraid it's my duty to ask you,"
corrected the Chief Inspector gently.
"I don't know if you've heard it, but there's an idea going about that your poor lady's death wasn't due to morphia at all."
The Chief Inspector looked his distaste at voicing such a shocking rumour. Dr. Bickleigh had no need to act his astonishment. "What? I don't understand. Of course it was due to morphia."
"The suggestion is,"
apologized the Chief Inspector,
"that it was due to arsenic, covered by a dose of morphia."
"Arsenic? Nonsense. It's quite out of the question."
"But you keep arsenic by you, sir, of course?"
"Only Fowler solution, and a very large quantity of that would have to be drunk to cause death."
"There isn't any white arsenic in your surgery or elsewhere to which she could have had access?"
"Certainly not. The whole idea is ludicrous." Chief Inspector Russell made a note.
"But you have arsenical weed killer on the premises, no doubt?"
"No, I haven't. There's been no arsenic in or near this house ever since I've been in it, except the small quantity of Fowler solution I keep in the surgery. You can take it that the suggestion is simply absurd, Chief Inspector."
"So I fancied, sir. But you'll understand that I had to put it to you, just as a matter of form."
The Chief Inspector folded up his notebook and stowed it away.
"Well, I think that's all, sir. Quite satisfactory, of course. In fact, I'm sorry to have troubled you."
"This idea of arsenic," Dr. Bickleigh puzzled. "I simply can't understand it. There'd be no question of accident there, I take it. And if the suggestion is that my poor wife deliberately took the stuff, it's such a painful death, you see. The wife of any medical man would know that. So why should she? Even if she had wanted to do away with herself when there was morphia ready to hand."
"I don't understand that myself, sir," admitted the Chief Inspector, "and that's a fact."
"Anyhow, you'd better see Dr. Lidston in Merchester. I called him in at once. He'll tell you that the appearances were perfectly consistent with death from morphine poisoning and nothing else. Certainly not arsenic." Out came the notebook again.
"Thank you, sir. Dr. Lidston. Yes, perhaps I'd better. You called him in, you say? I see. But he hadn't had your lady under his observation, I take it, during her illness?"
"Yes, indeed he had," retorted Dr. Bickleigh, not without triumph. "I'd called him in for a consultation only a short time before my wife's death. I was puzzled about her illness, you see, and the treatment Sir Tamerton Folliot recommended didn't seem to be doing her any good."
"Quite so. And there was no post-mortem, I understand?"
No, the coroner didn't think it necessary. The cause of death was quite obvious, you see. And of course, I had confided to Dr. Lidston the unfortunate habit my poor wife had formed. So that was no news to him.
Yes, quite so, sir. Then the real nature of her illness was never discovered?
No, not definitely. Dr. Bickleigh was getting simply bored with all this old history. But Lidston and I agreed that her headaches must have been due to a cerebral neoplasm of some sort, or tumour on the brain, as I said just now. In any case, it wasn't worth opening the body to find out, as that was not the cause of death.
No, of course not. I see, sir. Well...
The Chief Inspector rose ponderously to his feet.
Oh, yes, I was nearly forgetting. Would it be putting you to a lot of trouble just to let me have a look in your surgery, Doctor, and show me where you kept the syringe and all that? Just to establish that your poor lady had easy access to them, you understand.
Yes, quite. No, none at all. Come along, Chief Inspector. Hardly troubling to conceal his smile, Dr. Bickleigh led the way to his surgery. What on earth the fellow expected to gain by... It was somewhat abstractedly that he showed the man from Scotland Yard what he wanted to see. Dr. Bickleigh was pondering a certain course of action, bold perhaps, but not unsubtle. There was little time to make up his mind, but it was enough. He made his decision. Chief Inspector, I told you I couldn't pretend to be ignorant of these vile rumours. I can tell you further that I'm not ignorant of their source.
Sir?
The Chief Inspector looked puzzled. Oh, yes. I know perfectly well where they come from. A man named Chatford in Merchester, a solicitor. He dislikes me strongly, has a grudge against me, and has set these beastly ideas about to try and do me a bad turn.
Is that so, sir?
The Chief Inspector's voice expressed nothing but concern. I should like to ask your advice. Ought I to take steps against him for criminal libel? The facts, you see, are these. Dr. Bickleigh went on to give a very succinct account of Chatford's cause for his grudge. Nor did he trouble to hide the fact that Ivy had so completely given her husband away, and barely refrained from adding in plain words the poetic revenge that he himself had subsequently taken on his traducer. What ought I to do, Chief Inspector? He asked confidentially. Dr. Bickleigh did feel quite confidential with the man now. He was a fool, but he wasn't a bad fellow by any means, and it was interesting to talk on more or less intimate terms with a real detective from Scotland Yard. You can see for yourself that this kind of thing can't be allowed to go on. The man's mouth must be stopped. The Chief Inspector was interested, distinctly interested. He put a few questions. Dr. Bickleigh answered them with manly frankness. Ivy's character lay in ribbons at their feet.
Well, Doctor, if you take my advice, you'll do nothing for the time being. You don't want to drag the girl into the witness box to admit adultery, which is what it would lead to. If you're right in saying that these rumours do come from him, well, he's had the matter taken up officially and an inquiry made, which is what it seems he wanted, and I don't see what more he can do. It's my opinion he'll drop it now. If he doesn't... But anyhow, if I were you, I should wait and see.
Thank you, Chief Inspector. Yes, perhaps that would be best. Anyhow, I'm glad you know that it's entirely due to him that you've had to waste your time like this. Dr. Bickleigh concealed the vindictiveness he was feeling under an aspect of duty done. Chief Inspector Russell leaned back against the surgery counter and looked denser than ever.
Still, it's a bit of a puzzler, Doctor. If what you say is right, what's his idea? Even if it could be established that your poor lady did make away with herself, that's only going to bring up a lot of mud about her. How does he think he's going to get at you that way?
His wife says his idea is that if suicide could be proved, you see, I should have to leave the place.
But why, sir? I don't see that at all.
Oh, well, various things might come out, you know. Dr. Bickleigh grinned knowingly. We doctors have to be like Caesar's wife if we're to keep our practices. Anybody else can enjoy himself occasionally, and people only smile, but a doctor? Good gracious me, no. Chief Inspector Russell actually winked, broadly. It was very evident that with the stowing away of the notebook he had put off the official and become the genial, if somewhat stupid soul that he really was at heart.
Well, I won't say I'm not rather in that position myself, Doctor. But still, if one likes the ladies enough, one can always find some means, eh?
He winked again. Dr. Bickleigh chuckled delightedly. That was the sort of thing he had been brought up to before he had had to don this damned gentility. A regular tang of his youth, as unlike Wyvern's Cross as it was like Nottingham. A wave of kinship with this large human man, so mistakenly trying to be a detective, surged over him. Well, it's hard for a man to get on without them, I must say. Innuendos thickened the surgery air.
And, said the Chief Inspector with an envious air, I dare say a doctor has his opportunities more than some of us.
Well, if he doesn't, he can always make them, can't he? They laughed wickedly.
And ladies in the country must have something to occupy their time, I expect.
Dr. Bickleigh saw his opportunity to be rather cunning. Yes, and nobody but one's patients takes that sort of thing seriously, you know. Why, my poor wife. Yes, Chief Inspector, I lost a real understanding friend in her. A wonderful woman. I can tell you, there aren't many wives who have the sense to let their husbands, well, amuse themselves, and know it means nothing. She did that. Yes, indeed she did. She was one of the few really sensible women I've ever met. Dr. Bickleigh looked extremely serious. Inwardly he was thinking, and that knocks away even the ground for suicide. It was too easy. Well, well. The Chief Inspector was looking suitably serious too. He roused himself with an effort.
Well, I mustn't keep you any longer, Doctor. It's been most good of you to answer my question so frankly, and you understand, I'm sure, that I only had to do my duty?
Yes, of course, perfectly. And there's nothing more I can do for you? Asked Dr. Bickleigh expansively. I'm quite at your disposal. The big Chief Inspector seemed struck by this offer. Oh, that was very kind. Yes, since the doctor was so good, he would like to have a look over the house. Just as a matter of form, of course. It would help him with his report. Dr. Bickleigh agreed at once. It would be most amusing. They went over the house together. Although the suggestion had not come from him, the man from Scotland Yard made a thorough job of it while he was about it. Dr. Bickleigh, secretly much entertained, stood by while his visitor opened cupboards, peered into wardrobes, even looked under the bath, though what he expected to find there remained a complete mystery. You're making a regular search party of it, Chief Inspector.
Never do things by halves, Doctor, replied Chief Inspector Russell genially. That's our rule. It gives us a lot of trouble, but it saves us more in the long run.
Dr. Bickleigh felt he was obtaining an interesting insight into the methods of Scotland Yard. They did not impress him. The Chief Inspector penetrated even into the attic. He led the way up the last flight of stairs, and Dr. Bickleigh could not have stopped him had he wished. Not that he did wish. It could not matter in the least. So he carefully refrained from discouraging remarks, and followed with an air of eager helpfulness. His visitor stood in the middle of the room, and looked round at the litter of tools, test tubes, photographic appliances, wireless parts. Since Julia's death, Dr. Bickleigh had made wireless and the manufacture of sets for it something of a winter hobby, and general oddments, with a look of humorous dismay.
"Lucky I'm not making a real search party of it, sir. It'd take half a day to go through all this."
"My hobby room," explained the doctor. On a table already loaded with other impedimenta stood the incubator. The Chief Inspector's glance did not even hover there, as it swept in plain bewilderment round the room. The situation appealed to Dr. Bickleigh. Here, under the man's very nose. Well, really, if this was the best that Scotland Yard could do. He was almost tempted to say, casually, "And that thing over there is an incubator, you know." Probably the man did not even know what an incubator was. In any case, it would convey nothing to him.
"You go in for scientific experiments then, Doctor?" suggested the Chief Inspector, eyeing the test tubes.
"Oh, just a little research work occasionally. I've always been interested in it. Of course, a country GP doesn't get much chance, but one does what one can." The Chief Inspector advanced to the table on which the instruments lay, not the incubator table, and picked up a Bunsen burner, rather as if it were a Mills bomb.
"Chemistry, eh? Now, that's a thing I never knew anything about."
"No? Oh, it's quite fascinating. I'll tell you what I've been doing." Dr. Bickleigh explained how he had been amusing his leisure moments by passing chlorine through a solution of sodium thiosulfate.
"Oh, yes," said the other vaguely. "I believe I've heard of that. Have to use arsenic for that, don't you?"
"Certainly not," Dr. Bickleigh replied sharply. What was this arsenic motif that kept cropping up? "I told you downstairs there's no arsenic in the house at all, except the Fowler's solution in the surgery. What is the idea about this arsenic?" The Chief Inspector looked distressed.
"Oh, that. No, I wasn't thinking of that, Doctor. Just getting a bit mixed in my chemistry, that's all. Well, it's good of you to have shown me round like this. I think I've seen all I wanted."
They parted genially, the Chief Inspector still refusing a drink. Dr. Bickleigh returned to his consulting room and mixed himself another, a stiffer one this time. He felt extremely pleased with himself. It had been an amusing evening. But what a ridiculous pother to make over a question of possible suicide already over a year old. Red tape, no doubt. Well, anyhow, that would be the end of Chatford, in more senses than one. He woke up in the middle of the night, sweating with terror. It was all up. They knew he had killed Julia. They were going to prove it. They wouldn't rest till they had got him, hanged him. It was all up. Everything showed it. His brain was clear now. Everything was ghastly plain. How could he not have seen it before? Would they have sent a man down from Scotland Yard just on a case of suspected suicide? Of course not. It was murder they suspected. Murder. What was he to do? The Devonshire police had found out something. They had called in Scotland Yard, and Scotland Yard never let go. Good God! What was he to do? Everything showed it.
The Chief Inspector had refused to drink with him. That proved it, didn't it? Refused to drink with him. That was final. A policeman never refuses to drink with anyone, except a man he intends to arrest. Final. All those hints about jealous coroners had been bunkum. All the suggestions about suicide, just soft soap to put him off his guard. That geniality, a pose, to lure him into giving himself away, and good God, he had given himself away hopelessly. What hadn't he said? Got confidential? Hinted at woman-chasing? Showed his vindictiveness towards Chatford? Oh, given himself away disastrously. It was all up. How could he have been such a fool? He had made the fatal mistake. Underrated his opponent. The man had pretended to be a numbskull, and he had been taken in, and had thought it amusing. Oh, God! It was he who had been the fool. Everything showed it. The account of his movements. They wouldn't have wanted that if it was just a case of suicide, would they? Of course they wouldn't. They knew it was murder. And the man had taken that order on the Merchester chemist away with him. Away, to prove that it was in his own disguised handwriting, not a forgery at all. Away. And he would never be able to get it back and destroy it. That piece of paper was going to hang him. And that arsenic, what did that mean? Something mysteriously dreadful. They thought he had poisoned Julia with arsenic, and somehow they were going to prove it. But he hadn't. God, this was awful. He was going to be hanged for something he had never done. Arsenic, what did it mean? Hanged. He was going to be hanged. Hanged. By the neck. Until he was dead. Oh, why had he killed Julia? Why? It had been so silly, so ridiculously unnecessary. Why had he done it? Why? If only she was still alive. He wanted her so badly, unbearably. What was he to do? He sat up in the bed. A stiff, erect little figure in pink cotton pyjamas, his hair half on end from sleep, and rocked backwards and forwards, his knuckles to his mouth. If only he hadn't done it. If only Julia was still alive. Oh, moaned Dr. Bickleigh, and began to cry. Chapter 11. The next morning, Dr. Bickleigh's confidence had completely returned. The despair of the night had been a natural reaction, at a time when the vitality is at its lowest from the knowledge that Scotland Yard really were interesting themselves in Julia's death. Remembered in the friendly light of day, it seemed like a nightmare, and almost as preposterous. Of course murder was not suspected. How could it be? There was simply no grounds for suspicion. Chatford had made a fuss, and, since he was a solicitor, and presumably a man of weight, the Home Office had been bound to look into his mare's nest, even to the extent of sending a man down from London to make out a report. How fortunate that he had told the Chief Inspector Chatford's reason. That proved him so much of an interested party that his ridiculous accusations simply lost all weight. Of course, too, the Chief Inspector had been satisfied. It was incredible that he could have been so friendly had he not been. He would have been stiff and official if he had thought he was investigating a case of murder, not genial and apologetic. Scotland Yard apologizing to a suspected murderer. Not likely. And even
reasoned Dr. Bickleigh over his eggs and bacon. If the impossible did happen, had happened, and the possibility of murder ever had been raised, well, what did it matter? Nothing could ever be proved in the case of Julia any more than in the cases of Chatford and Madeleine. Not a thing. He was on velvet. Really, Dr. Bickleigh could hardly understand why any murderer who took the merest intelligent precautions should ever be brought to trial at all. But of course, that was it. The fools did not take intelligent precautions because they hadn't the intelligence. Chatford. Wouldn't it be advisable to let well alone? Chatford might be dying, in which case excellent. But on the other hand, he might not, and one hardly wanted to commit a murder right under the nose of a Scotland Yard detective. Yes, if Chatford did die now, it really would be murder. Most curious. But yet again, could he in justice to himself let Chatford off? By every canon, Chatford deserved to die. As long as Chatford lived, it was most difficult. And then there was Ivy. Good gracious, yes. He had been almost forgetting Ivy. Ivy, bringing with her as Chatford's widow all the excellent possessions that Chatford had so industriously massed together. Ivy and independence at last. Now that would be a revenge worthy of himself. Oh, yes. Chatford must die. But Scotland Yard should not be bothered, not in the least. Chatford should die a nice, ordinary, natural death. Poison? Absurd. The silly man ate some bad potted meat, you know. Well, if people will do these things, they must expect to take the consequences. Wasn't there a similar case in Wyvern's Cross? A child named, oh, yes, Samford. Yes, of course. Botulism they called it, didn't they? And now Mr. Chatford the same? Well, well. Dr. Bickleigh could hear the words actually on the worthy's lips. He smiled unconsciously as he finished his coffee and neatly dabbed with a napkin at his little waxed moustache. Now then, Chatford. But to see Chatford was apparently not quite so simple as Dr. Bickleigh had reckoned. At the house he met with a blank refusal, and a door very nearly slammed in his face. Mr. Chatford was rather worse today, and far too ill to see anyone. And before Dr. Bickleigh could even speak again, bang! The door closed by the agitated maid right on his words. Well, no use trying that again, Dr. Bickleigh reflected temperately as he climbed into his car. Chatford was evidently determined not to be seen by him or anyone else. Unfortunately, however, for Chatford, Dr. Bickleigh was equally determined to see him. And where this regenerated Dr. Bickleigh had made up his mind to anything, he drove through the streets of Manchester, a consciously grim figure of death. Chatford need not hope to escape that way. If direct methods failed, subtlety always remained. Dr. Lidston was out. Dr. Bickleigh, growing grimmer every moment, hung about in Merchester until the other could not possibly be out any longer. Then he went back. This time he was more lucky. Dr. Lidston had just come in to lunch. Dr. Lidston received him quite effusively for a man normally so restrained.
"Ah, Bickleigh. Excellent. Haven't seen you for quite a long time. How are you? Yes, I was expecting you."
Expecting me? Dr. Lidston's tall, spare form seemed to coil itself round his consulting-room chair in an effort to find a comfortable position. He cleared his throat very loudly.
"Yes, that... I understand you referred him to me. Most awkward. Very, distressing. Of course, I confirmed.
Oh, yes. He came, did he? At last, Dr. Bickleigh understood the other's embarrassed references. He had been so absorbed in his present business that he had quite forgotten about the Scotland Yard man. Well, the fellow would not have got much change out of Lydston. After all, Lydston had given his own opinion on Julia's case, and he had his professional position to consider. Not, of course, that Lydston could tell the police anything, even if he wanted. Death had been perfectly consistent with morphia poisoning. Because death had been due to morphia poisoning, what more could one want? Still, all that mattered less than nothing now. Yes, that's right. I referred him to you, but that isn't what I've come about now. Look here, Lydston, I'm bothered. I hear Chatford's been taken bad. You're his medical man, aren't you? How does he strike you? Dr. Lydston seemed to be weighing his answer with his usual caution before he gave it, looking thoughtfully at Dr. Bickleigh through his spectacles and then hastily looking away again.
Well, he's in a pretty bad way, he said at last, and twined himself a little more impossibly round his chair.
Really dangerous?
Decidedly, I should say.
Yes, but how much so? Likely to prove fatal? Dr. Lydston looked at him thoughtfully again.
Possibly. Possibly not.
Dr. Bickleigh subdued his irritation. Silly old creature. Why couldn't he say straight out what Chatford's chances were? However, he was in a bad way anyhow, but not quite bad enough. Just a little edging nearer the precipice. Well, I'm worried. He came to tea with me the other day, you know, day before yesterday. The Bournes were there too, 4 of us. Well, 3 out of the 4 were taken bad in the night. Really, I'm afraid...
Bourne wasn't taken ill?
No. He was the only one who wasn't.
Oh, you were then?
Yes, I was. Quite violently. Fortunately, however, I must have eliminated most of the poison and... Poison, eh? Interrupted Dr. Lydston quite sharply, looking at Dr. Bickleigh now over his spectacles instead of through them.
You suggest you were poisoned?
Well, surely. Pretty obvious, isn't it? Dr. Lydston joined the tips of his long fingers and contemplated them with apparently earnest admiration.
And, what do you imagine was the nature of this poison?
Oh, I don't know. Some food poison, I suppose. It was Dr. Bickleigh's turn to be cautious. That's just what I wanted to see you about. I don't want to butt in or anything like that, you know, but how are you treating the case? Dr. Lydston's professional dignity was clearly upset.
Well, really,
he began stiffly. Dr. Bickleigh hastened to eradicate an unfavourable impression and put on his most winning smile. That sounds awful cheek coming from me to you, but I really am interested. I was caught myself, you see, and it was a literal case of physician heal thyself. And yesterday I called to inquire about Mrs. Bourne, just a friendly visit, of course, and saw her for a few moments, as perhaps you've heard. Yes, the old fool would certainly have heard, so you'd better be smoothed down over that, too. I know you attend her, so I was careful not to verge on the professional. But out of sheer interest I asked her a few questions, and her symptoms were certainly identical with mine, and presumably with Chatford's too. He paused, questioningly.
The cases certainly do present points of resemblance, admitted Dr. Lydston.
Pedantic old fool. Yes. Well, Dr. Bickleigh smiled again, most disarmingly. The fact is, I wondered whether I could possibly be of any help. Chatford's case certainly sounds the most serious of the three, and, well, I did cure myself, didn't I?
Are you suggesting that I call you in for a consultation?
Asked Dr. Lidston precisely. Something like that, perhaps. Dr. Bickleigh dissembled his eagerness. I know it's a most unprofessional thing to suggest, but after all, we're all more or less friends, and, well, I really do think I could be of help.
How did you treat yourself?
Oh, well, Dr. Bickleigh laughed. I'd much rather hear your own suggestions.
Dr. Lidston deliberated. Chatford called me up in the middle of the night. He was in a good deal of pain, so I gave him an injection of morphia and ordered hot applications to the abdomen. Later on I recommended a colon washout of normal saline and made him up a prescription of bismuth and soda with hydrocyanic acid.
Dr. Bickleigh nodded. Yes, treatment on normal lines, in fact.
I saw no reason to advise anything else, replied Dr. Lidston stiffly.
No, quite. But in my case, well, I won't bother you with that. But seriously, Lidston, I should very much like to have a look at him, out of sheer professional interest. Surely you could stretch a point and take me with you. What about this afternoon?
Somewhat irregular, isn't it? And in any case I could do nothing without the patient's consent.
Oh, Chatford wouldn't mind, said Dr. Bickleigh easily.
He might object most strongly, remarked Dr. Lidston dryly. No, Bickleigh, I'm sorry. I think it would be too irregular.
Oh, come, persuaded Dr. Bickleigh. Stretch a point, Lidston. He won't mind. Dr. Lidston, however, seemed to have made up his mind at last. He rose.
I'm afraid it isn't a thing I could agree to. In fact, I don't care about it at all. I'm sorry.
Oh, very well. Dr. Bickleigh smiled. After all, it doesn't matter in the least. And no doubt you're quite right to be so old-fashioned, Lidston, in questions of etiquette as well as treatment. 2 little spots were burning on his cheekbones. The two parted without shaking hands. Dr. Bickleigh drove away, rigid with fury. That damned old fool. If he didn't look out, it would be his turn next. It had been a sheer insult, a reflection on his own professional competence, nothing less. Dr. Bickleigh fingered through the cloth the little file in his trousers pocket. Lidston had better look out. He didn't seem to realize what sort of a man he was dealing with. And if the two of them thought they were going to keep him out of that bedroom... In his consulting room, Dr. Lidston, after staring at his blotting pad for 5 minutes, pulled the telephone towards him. After all, there could have been no conspiracy to keep Dr. Bickleigh out of the bedroom. He had hardly finished his belated lunch an hour later when his telephone bell rang. It was Dr. Lidston.
Oh, Bickleigh, I've been thinking over what you suggested. I couldn't do anything without Chatford's consent, of course, but I've just put it to him, and he has no objection at all.
Oh, yes, said Dr. Bickleigh, with a mighty effort of indifference.
And I must confess, proceeded Dr. Lidston in his precise tones, that the case does present certain puzzling features. So, if your offer still holds good...
You're inviting me into a consultation?
Yes, in a way. Yes, certainly.
How would 3:30 suit you?
Admirably.
Very well. I'll be there. Dr. Bickleigh's exultation was so great that his hand shook as he hung up the receiver. Chatford was delivered into his grasp. He went into the surgery. Since the morning, a better idea had occurred to him. With meticulous care, he prepared a capsule, his thoughts darting brightly from one rosy realization to another. Revenge was sweet, but ivy was sweeter. Rich, widowed ivy. Yes, riches were sweetest of all. And with Chatford out of the way, those ridiculous inquiries must collapse. Their mainspring would have been removed. Though for that matter they must have collapsed already. Had he really, in the middle of the night, taken them so seriously? It was curious to remember now. Most interesting how lowered vitality depressed the brain. Triumph of matter over mind. The Chief Inspector would be back in London by now, his report of a mare's nest in his pocket. In a way, it was rather a pity. It would have been amusing to remove the instigator of it under his very nose.